Greetings, fellow Who-gazers, and welcome back to Doctor Who Literature, the podcast taking you through the world of the target novelizations in publication order. My name is Jason, and I'm your host on this journey, this very long journey. We're very excited this week to talk about the novelization of Doctor Who and the Brain of Morbius. As we'll discuss over the next hour and a half or so, this is a story that is still very important to the ongoing Doctor Who universe, that is still unfolding before our eyes in the year 2022, which is more than 45 years after Brain of Morbius was written, edited, filmed, and released. A story with very long legs, a story with a very interesting novelization by the great Terrance Dicks, and my guest and I, my first-time guest, are going to talk about it at length, starting in a couple of minutes' time. Some programming notes. There's an awful lot of other Jason available on the internet right now. I have been in two other very superior to this one Doctor Who podcasts. You can hear me briefly in episode 100 of Reality Bomb, which just came out a day or two ago. I will post a link to that in the show notes. Reality Bomb is basically the perfect Doctor Who podcast, and Graham and Joy do an incredible job with that. I'm very happy to have even a small part in episode 100. And then I did my first episode of Gallifrey's Most Wanted earlier this week with Ross talking about, coincidentally, the Tom Baker years and PBS, which is how we both encountered Tom Baker in the States. And that was really, really a fun conversation with Ross. Ross has been on this show twice before. He has been on my episodes discussing Curse of Peladon and 10th Planet, and you'll be hearing a lot more of him on this show in the years to come. And it was very nice to go on his show as well. I will post a link in the show notes. I highly recommend you check that out. I will be doing another Trap 1 in a week or two, but I was very lucky to host Mark from Trap 1 and his wife. They were both visitors to New York, and I love playing host to tourists visiting my home city. We're going to talk about that on the next Trap 1, but I did get to spend time with them. And on Twitter, there's a photo of the two of us in Times Square with the Trap 1 logo appearing in an unexpected place. So check that episode out. I will post the link to that after it is recorded and released. So I've been very, very busy. But of course, I've been busy on Doctor Who literature as well. This is a weekly show, so I'm reading a novelization a week, having a conversation with a friend/guest about Doctor Who and the books once a week. A very fun use of my time as we reach the latter stages of the pandemic. As I am slowly cycling back to going to work in the office, I am still certainly making time for this show, which is just a wonderful experience all the way through. So without any further ado, I'm going to bridge to my discussion with Adam Clegg from the Real McCoy podcast. We are going to talk about Doctor Who and the Brain of Morbius and many, many, many other Doctor Who or related and adjacent topics. Let's get to it. And we're back on Doctor Who literature. I'm very happy to be joined for the first time by Adam Clegg from the Real McCoy podcast. Adam, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
You and I have worked together before. We have done a couple of Trap 1s. I know that I met you in person for the first time at the Gallifrey 1 convention in Los Angeles earlier this year, 2022. And you and I did sort of a snap Trap 1 reaction episode about a week later. And I know that we also did, along with Mark from Trap 1, we did an episode on Sophie Aldred's co-written book, At Childhood's End. I'll say that again, At Childhood's End, her book about Ace's future, a couple of years ago. I thought it was last year, but I guess they came out in 2020, at the beginning of the pandemic.
Yes, I have a strong memory of queuing up at Forbidden Planet to get her to sign it, and that would have been about February 2020.
Oh, even before the pandemic started.
Yeah, it came out it would have been about a month, I guess, before all that kicked off.
It shows you how much the pandemic has skewed our sense of time, because it felt like I recorded that episode not even a year ago, but it must have been 2.5 at this point.
Yes, no, I'm the same. I can't remember what I've recorded when anymore. I just accept every day as it comes.
Like Ian Chesterton in An Unearthly Child. So there's obviously, this goes without saying, plenty of quality Doctor Who podcasts out there, and there's always something good jockeying for my attention. I do want to say that Real McCoy is probably one of the 10 that I keep in heavy rotation, where I make sure to catch every episode. But just for, if there happens to be somebody in my audience who is not familiar with The Real McCoy, tell us about that show. Who else is with you? How did it come to start? And what do you guys cover?
Well, The Real McCoy, as the title suggests, is an in-depth look at the Seventh Doctor era, which I do with my regular co-host, Eric Stadnick, and sometimes we have guests on as well. And at the moment, we have covered all the television stories, except for the TV movie. And we're now looking at a selection of the new adventures. We're not looking at all 61, because I don't think I can persuade Eric to hold on for that long. But we're covering about 15, 16 or so. Kind of like the major tentpoles and a few personal favourites. So that's been running for a while now. And as to how it started, Eric and I can never quite agree on who asked who to do it. I feel I probably asked Eric, as it's my personal favourite era. But Eric seems to think he asked me. So we'll just have to, one day we'll have to look back for the Twitter messages and actually clarify it. But at the moment, I like to think we have an air of mystery about how it started.
It's always good when these things are shrouded in mystery, because while failure is an orphan, success has many fathers, and certainly Real McCoy has a success.
Thank you. I like to imagine in 20 years' time, someone like David Howe will be looking for our Twitter messages trying to reconstruct the beginning. But we'll see.
For the second volume of his New Adventures book, perhaps. I got to say that the McCoy era, for me, when it started on television, I know that I first saw Time and the Rani in the States. I have a specific memory that it aired on March 26, 1988, because it was my mother's birthday, and we were out for the day, and I was terrified of staying out too late and missing the episode. Shows you where my priorities are. But as I watched it, I grew more and more disenchanted, and I know by the time they showed it in movie format that night, by the time it was halfway over, I had ejected and given up and just turned off the television. Then when the Cartmel episodes came around about a year or so later, when they started screening everything from Paradise Towers up through Survival, I was also, age 15, 16, very disenchanted. And granted, when you're 15 and 16 years old, there's a lot of other things jockeying for your attention. But I just didn't understand the stories, and I had thought at that age that it was a major step backwards in quality. Took me a while to realize what was going on politically, and in terms of subcontext, and in terms of some very specific cultural allusions that, being a teenager in the States, I would never have picked up on. Like Happiness Patrol made no sense to me when I would have seen it in 1988 or 89. Years later, thanks to Reckard's Doctor Who and I guess what would laughingly be described as my own personal maturity, it did make sense. And as for the New Adventures, those came out when I was 18. I had just about joined Reckard's Doctor Who. For me, the New Adventures were where Doctor Who was at throughout the 1990s, and I've been rereading them almost perpetually over the years. So the New Adventures it was the moment that I joined organized fandom, and for me, the New Adventures are almost the creative pinnacle of Doctor Who. So what are the books that you are covering for the New Adventures for Real McCoy?
Well, we started with Time Worm Revelation by Paul Cornell, and like I said, we're basically doing, I think, what you call the big hitters in the range. So we did that. We have done Time's Crucible, We have also done Transit, which is less of a big hitter, but I want to talk about, as I remember the reaction to this in the 90s, where it was literally listed as one of the worst things in science fiction in one magazine. So I was really keen to go back and have a look. I mean, yeah, it is. It's got its moments.
You can go back to the Records Doctor Who archives, which are now housed on Google Groups, and if you search from about January 1993, give or take a couple of weeks in either direction, you will see my instant review, my hot take, so to speak, for the first 50 pages of Transit, which I had purchased at a bookstore in Baltimore where I was living at the time, and I just torched it, really hated it, didn't understand. It wasn't so much that I didn't understand what Aronovich was trying to do, telling a cyberpunk version of the future, I should say, but it was that I just couldn't follow along his prose or train of thought. So I know that I was able to read the words, but the plot and the context made no sense to me. It's fair to say that the only part of the book that I remembered 6 months afterwards was the little description of what you do with cola nuts.
Always a way to identify a Doctor Who fan who read the New Adventures in the 90s is see their reaction to the term cola nuts.
But when I did my big reread of the New Adventures starting in 2010, when I got back to Transit, I was dreading it. And again, I don't know if this was, again, what you would laughingly describe as Jason's personal maturity or the passage of time or just having a wider context for what was going on. It suddenly made sense. I was able to follow the plot. I was able to appreciate, if not fully enjoy, what he was doing. Certainly the level that he's writing at and the references and the cultural allusions and the philosophy that he throws in there would have been well over my head as a college sophomore in every sense of the word. But there's a pun in there about Edith Piaf, which had me laughing out loud in 2010, 2011, which I know for a fact I wouldn't even have known who Edith Piaf was in 1993. So one of those books that I had to mature into, kind of like the McCoy era itself.
Well, I think it's an interesting first novel from Aronovich, and now he actually has a successful career as a novelist, and it definitely lacks, say, the easy readability of Rivers of London, but it's an interesting work that doesn't deserve. It's not a great work, but it doesn't deserve the reputation it had, and it was definitely interesting revisiting it. Equally, we revisited Left-Handed Hummingbird, which is Kate Orman's debut. I really like her work, so that was really good to do. The last one that's out at the time of this recording is our look at Conundrum, which is a personal favourite of Eric's, and was actually I really enjoyed. I got a lot more from it on this read. And our next one, we've set up a recording date for All Consuming Fire, which again is a personal favourite of mine, or was when I was a teenager and I was reading them. I haven't read it for probably at least 10 years, maybe 15. So I'm curious to see if that really holds up or if I'm going to be a little bit disappointed.
Interesting that you mentioned that particular run of books. I will say that when Rivers of London came out, I wasn't aware of it. I became aware of it a few years ago. There was a paperback copy of it that was left for giveaway on a stoop in my Brooklyn neighborhood. And somebody had read it and decided just, put it on the stoop so somebody else in the neighborhood could pick it up and take it away rather than throw out the book. What the person who gave Rivers of London away probably didn't know is that they were living in the house that Isaac Asimov had been living in 1940, according to the 1940 U.S. Census. So that was an interesting little bit of a historical rhyme, that Isaac Asimov and Ben Aronovich have both shared the same house, decades apart.
Small world.
Very small. Brooklyn is a very small borough. Left-Handed Hummingbird was just one of my absolute favorites. That was a book that spoke to me directly in 1993 because you have references from everything to Star Trek The Next Generation and the Eagles, and a large chunk of it takes place in New York City, which is my hometown, plus Titanic. That book tickled my imagination more than any other. And it also helped that Kate Orman was on Records Doctor Who to announce that the book was commissioned. And she was there to answer questions and very generously answer all my emails. What does this mean? What does that mean? What does this mean? What does that mean? So Left-Handed Hummingbird was a huge part of my fandom. Conundrum I also terrifically enjoyed. Not to spoil it for anyone in our mutual audience who hasn't read it yet, but it is a sequel to a beloved black and white story. And Conundrum is very, very creative and very, very clever. And it also has a terrific cover, the original 1994 cover. So, I haven't heard that one yet, but I'm very curious to hear what you guys made of it.
Yeah, no, it was a fun one to revisit.
And All Consuming Fire is the Sherlock Holmes one, no?
Yes, yes. It's basically Doctor Who meets Sherlock Holmes meets H.P. Lovecraft, or at least that's how I remember it. So,
Yeah, my recollection is that the first half takes place in Holmes's Victorian era London, and then the second half takes place on a Cthulhu-type world in outer space.
yes, I remember the first half more than the second half, but that sounds about right.
Yeah, I know I tremendously loved the first half of the book. The second half didn't really speak to me, not having been a Lovecraft fan at the time. I guess that came out in '94 as well. Andy Lane, though, terrific writer, and Original Sin, which came out a year later, was one of my favorite new adventures, full stop. Original Sin was unfortunately spoiled for me on Records Doctor Who. Somebody gave away the identity of the main villain, and I wish I had not known that going in. But if you try and set that aside, a really enjoyable book. Brings back, it's not a sequel to the original story, but it brings back a great villain. And just great world building. And of course, that's, I think, the book that introduces Chris and Roz, who were
Yeah.
the two major companions for the back half of the NA's run.
Yes, we will be covering Original Sin at some point. It's on the list.
So, of course, not to monopolize your time here talking about the new adventures, this is not yet an NA's podcast. And, of course, I did a documentary on the first year of the NA's for Trap One last year. And if I ever get around to Volume 2 of that, which would cover the 1992 and 93 books, I'll certainly want to speak to you and Eric about that. But let's, I guess, segue into our main topic of conversation today, talking about the classic series and the novelizations. Adam, what is your origin story into Doctor Who fandom? When did you first start following the show, the books, etc.?
Well, I was born in 1981, so growing up in the 80s as a kid, I was aware of Doctor Who in the way that I think everyone was. It was just part of the kind of cultural background of Britain at the time. And actually, my parents always watched it. My mum and dad still watch it to this day. It's something we can always talk about. But I first kind of became aware of it. Probably must have been around 87, 88. Or I became aware of McCoy's Doctor. Like, I have quite a strong memory of seeing a trailer for, I guess it would have been Remembrance of the Daleks Part 3, where the hand where McCoy's looking into the Dalek casing that's been blown up, and the kind of tentacle comes out and grabs him. I have a really strong mental image of that. And then it would have been 89. I watched episode 1 of The Curse of Fenric, which I think I did enjoy, but I was also an overly sensitive child. So it kind of terrified me, and I didn't watch it again. I mean, I was terrified by the X-Files in '93, so I remained a sensitive child for quite a long time until I don't know. I just suddenly now love horror films and horror comics particularly. But I always thought if Doctor had carried on for at least another year or two, I probably would have started watching it regularly with my parents. And then, so Doctor ends, and they then about 92, 93, they do a series of repeats on BBC Two for the 30th anniversary. One story from each Doctor, and then some other stories. They showed a couple of Bakers and a couple of Pertwees. And I watched those, and I remember really liking it, and I was a bit of a nerdy kid anyway, but it wasn't until 96, when just before the TV movie came out, and suddenly you were hearing about Doctor Who all over again, and I ended up with vouchers. I went to Boots, which nowadays is just a chemist, but used to sell videos, weirdly enough. And I just randomly chose Time and the Rani, because I knew I liked Sylvester McCoy, and that was a Sylvester McCoy story they had. And reading the back, it was like, this is his very first one. So I was like, oh, this is going to be great. And I loved it. I absolutely loved it. And I've had periods where I've maybe not been as into it. Like, there was a gap before the new series came back, where I wasn't active as a fan, but I've always really been a fan since then. So almost 3/4 of my life, if not more, now. So there we go. Can't get out if I wanted to.
1981, youngster. Wow. So you have vivid memories of part one of Curse of Fenric. That was another one of those stories that I watched as a late teenager when it first hit PBS in the States. Gotta say that Curse of Fenric Part 1 has to be pretty challenging to the young viewer. You would have been about 8 at the time, I guess, because the monsters don't show up in Part 1 of the story really on screen. And there's a lot of things in there that require you to know about World War II and communism and fascism and Hitler and Alan Turing and the Enigma Machine and the Prisoner's Dilemma and Vikings and runestones and a priest who's lost his faith in humanity. There's an awful lot going on in Curse of Fenric that it wouldn't seem to me would speak to an 8-year-old, at least until you get to the later half of the story when the Hemivores kick in. Do you recall being bewildered by Curse of Fenric, or did it speak to you right away? I know that I struggled with it for a long time before I realized that it was one of the all-time greats.
I don't remember being bewildered. I remember things like the cliffhanger, and I remember a couple of scenes. I have a bit of a Mandela effect with it because I know it must have been part one because of the cliffhanger, but I have a distinct memory of runes appearing on the wall, which it does happen, but doesn't happen to the second part of the story. Then again, there are so many versions of Curse of Fenric that I think maybe I've just, who knows. No, but I think you're right. It's something of a dense text. But you, as all viewers do, and as an 8-year-old, you pick up on different things. You being a kid in Britain, you kind of know about the Second World War. Particularly in the 80s, it's was still a living memory. People, it was always part of the cultural background to a great extent. So you got understood that setting, and you just pick up. I can't remember what I picked up on. I remember I think you see a hand of a Hemivore, and I remember that. So no, I don't think I was bewildered. I think I was a little unnerved by it. I think is my main memory. But I'm really happy to think back about that. I can remember my reaction to other Doctor Who stories later on far more strongly than that. But it's more of a feeling than that I have about it than oh yeah, this is what I thought at the time.
It is very atmospheric in terms of the direction and the incidental score, which I think is by Mark Ayers.
Yeah.
So definitely a wonderful story in every sense. At what point would you have become aware of the Target novelizations, and perhaps when did you start reading those?
Oh, this is a little trickier for me pinning it down because my dad has a big collection of sci-fi books, kind of Isaac Asimov, Arthur C. Clarke, J.G. Ballard, a lot of short stories, stuff like that. And among there, he did have actually Doctor Who Mask of Mandragora novelization, and I think I was vaguely aware then. During the 90s, because I always say I am a child of the wilderness years, because that's when I really became a fan. A lot more time was spent for me getting the VHSs that were coming out, or the New Adventures or Missing Adventures. So I really I picked up Target novelizations, but only occasionally. So I had Revenge of the Cybermen. I had this they did re-release a few where it was 2 books in one, and I definitely had the Dominators and the Crotons, and I will say the Dominators is definitely better in text than it is watching it on screen. I remember that. I don't have it anymore. I don't know where my copy is. Sadly, I don't think I have it anymore, but I definitely know I didn't fall asleep reading it, while I did fall asleep watching it on balance. So it's always been there's a bit of a gap in some ways in my knowledge. I've read some, but I haven't read the majority. And that was what's so nice about coming onto here and getting a chance to read Brain of Morbius, actually, because I was like, oh, this is really good. I'm not one of the people who grew up with the novelizations in quite the same way. Because by the time I was into fandom, they weren't producing them anymore. But I do also remember things like I got the novelization of Evil of the Daleks from the library. That was actually quite a big one for me, because I've loved Evil ever since. But that's really stuck with me, that novelization.
Yeah. Dominators is again, the TV story is, my frequent guest Fraser and I will have very significant disagreements about the Dominators. It's one of his favorites. It is charitable to say that it's not one of mine. Hey, Fraser. But the book by Ian Marter, and we discussed Ian Marter on this show for the first time last week, episode 32, talking about The Ark in Space, which was his debut novelization. He was a terrific writer in the way that he adds atmosphere and a visceral sense to the story, which is utterly lacking in the on-screen production, which was an unfortunate end to Morris Battery's otherwise quite effective Doctor Who career as director.
And actually, I forgot, this is odd for me, but I did pick up a copy of Doctor Who in an exciting adventure with the Daleks, which I remember just loving, because I remember being like, oh my god, this is a totally different beginning. But I really like it, because I do think, for me, David Whittaker, even when he's adapting Terry Nation's work, is for me, in many ways, the definitive Dalek writer, and it's a very atmospheric book. I do remember that's stuck with me over the years, actually. That I always remember Everlasting Matches for some reason.
What I'll say about Doctor Who and the Daleks, the very first novelization, which I covered solo back in episode 1 here, I follow Michael Chabon, who was not only the showrunner for the first season of Star Trek Picard, but is also one of my favorite all-time writers, full stop. He posted a day or two on Instagram the title page to Doctor Who in an exciting adventure with the Daleks, autographed by Neil Gaiman, I believe addressed to Chabon's son, with a Neil Gaiman drawing of a Dalek on the page, which made me tremendously jealous. I would love to be involved in any conversation between Neil Gaiman and the Chabon family about Doctor Who. And here's one autographing a copy of that book to the other. It's just an incredible moment for me.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think Whittaker, obviously he only wrote two novelizations, but there's an influence there that we rightly talk about Terrance Dicks's influence on future writers with his many novelizations, but I think Whittaker is there as a subtler influence as well, on people like Neil Gaiman. I feel it's harder to track because he wrote less, but it's definitely there.
Right. I mean, having a good working knowledge of the novelizations, I should say, is a big help as you're reading the NAs and the MAs and the EDAs and the PDAs, because all those writers came up with the target books, and there's always references or allusions or nods anytime you see a chapter called Escape to Danger, or anytime you see the word capacious. I know Paul Mars in The Scarlet Empress did a whole afterword talking about his involvement in Doctor Who fandom, and he said that the word capacious will always identify you as a Doctor Who fan, just because that word showed up so frequently in the novelizations and so infrequently everywhere else. In terms of The Brain of Morbius, then, which is this week's book, when did you first watch that on television or video, and when did you first read the Terrance Dicks novelization?
I definitely had Brain of Morbius on VHS in the 90s, and it was one I watched a lot. I think it's probably my favourite Hinchcliffe. And I read the novelization for this podcast, so only finished it about a week ago. Because, like I said, because I had it on VHS, I didn't seek out the novelization so much, because in the 90s I tended to get novelizations of stories I didn't have, and I must have gotten Brain of Morbius fairly early on. I know I had the unedited version. It wasn't the hour-long.
I was gonna ask. You don't have the infamous 58-minute cut down of Brain of Morbius?
No, I'd be kind of curious to see it, but no, I'm glad to say I had the full edition.
Brain of Morbius was a story that I've gone back and forth on over the years. When I first saw it airing on PBS in the States in early 1985, I would have been 11. And I just loved it. There's a lot going on there for the 11-year-old to enjoy, because you have the monster, You have Tom Baker giving a very funny performance, and then you have a lot of vivid settings and characters. Plus, it's such an homage to Frankenstein, which even in the 1980s, any 11-year-old boy or girl, I suppose, would have known about. So I loved it. Then, when I watched it again in college, when I would have been in my very late teens or early 20s, I thought it was ridiculous. I thought it was embarrassing. I thought it was a dinosaur. I thought it was in the so bad it's good category, but I thought it wasn't meant to be taken seriously. And I thought it was just an example of why Doctor Who needed to be revived and enter the 1990s, because this 1970s stuff no longer held up. That in itself is, I'm going to say it now, just a stupid opinion. It's the mark of a 20-year-old who's not quite as smart as he thinks he is, and is perhaps frustrated that Doctor Who is not evolving along with him. But coming full circle and watching it now in my, well, I guess it would not be honest to say my mid-40s anymore, I think Brain of Morbius is probably one of Doctor Who's greatest scripts, because think about what Robert Holmes does here. He reinvents the Time Lords, really. This is a year before Deadly Assassin, but the groundwork for all the changes that he makes to the Time Lords really begin in this story, where the Time Lords are sort of shadow antagonists. And then you have the language. I'll talk about this a little bit later in the program when I'm dissecting the book, but the insults that he has are vivid and colorful and memorable. And there's never a time in your life where it's ever going to be appropriate to say to somebody that you're a chicken brain biological disaster. But Robert Holmes says it for us vicariously, and the things that he has Dr. Solon say and some of the things the Doctor and Morbius say are just endlessly quotable. I think if you put any two Doctor Who fans together of a certain age, you will hear a quote from Brain of Morbius before a few minutes have gone by. Is that fair to say?
Yes, I think it is. It is very quotable. Particularly some Morbius lines about a condition why envy a vegetable, and it helps that you've got Philip Maddock doing a lot of that dialogue, because there isn't a single Doctor Who story that couldn't be improved by casting Philip Maddock. Even the stories he's already in, if you just had him play another role as well, it would, double the fun. But no, I think it's great. Like you say, it's Holmes. The Hinchcliffe era is a very consistent, very good era, but it's also, you get the impression it's just Robert Holmes working 48 hours a day just trying to get scripts ready, because he does a lot of rewrites actually. But this is the one you really feel like he's having fun on, and maybe that's because he's rewriting a Terrence script, so there's maybe already a structure in place and he can relax a bit more. But no, it is for me. It is partly, I think, because you say it's ridiculous, and it is ridiculous. I mean, I adore the Sisterhood of Khan, and I adore the couple of bits where they keep going death, 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 death. Every couple of times cracks me up, but it manages to hit exactly the right tone. Like, you can see the threat is always serious, but at the same time, and the Doctor is genuinely worried and scared, and so Sarah. But at the same time, it just walks really thin, really narrow line, and it's a beautiful tightrope act, I think.
And Brain of Morbius has very, very much cast a shadow over the new series in two different senses. Number one, in that the Sisterhood is a presence in the new series, and they were responsible via webisode for the Eighth Doctor regenerating into the John Hurt War Doctor. And then at the same time, you have them present in, I think it was Hellbent. So they've literally been in an on-screen episode. So that's one sense where Stephen Moffat certainly was influenced by Brain of Morbius. But then, I guess we're going to have to talk about this at some point. The Brain of Morbius faces, the what we now call the timeless child faces.
Yes, it's interesting, because when I was reading the book, there was a couple of moments I thought, I wonder how Terrence is going to handle this. Is he going to change it or keep it as is? And the mind bending contest is interesting, because he mentions the Doctor's other faces, Pertwee, Troughton, and Hartnell, and then he basically goes, and then there were some others, and he doesn't clarifying that. He doesn't go, "Oh, these were past doctors" or anything like that. It's very ambiguous. And yeah, I always think that Robert Holmes would find the timeless children thing hilarious because Robert Holmes didn't care about continuity. Robert Holmes just, if he got in the way of a story, you got rid of it. I mean, the classic example is the Two Doctors, where and I think he's trolling Ian Levine personally, maybe, but he's just that kind of attitude that was around in the production office about continuity. So he just writes a script where he brings back a doctor, but there's no way you can actually fit what we see in with what had gone before because he just doesn't care. It's not important to him. So this idea of that what is basically an inside production joke to an extent, those faces being treated as some kind of sacred text that must be brought forward. I think he'd find that hilarious. I really do.
He and Terrence Dicks certainly had a very productive relationship where they would challenge and build on one another. As you say, Brain of Morbius began life as a Terrence Dicks story, where I think it was the other way around. It was the robot building the man. And at least according to the DVD text commentary, the Blu-rays haven't come out for season 13 yet, so we don't have any access to Terrence Dicks' original storylines, if those exist. But according to what I understand, his scripts were unfilmable from a production standpoint because they couldn't make that kind of robot. So Robert Holmes had to rewrite it on the fly, and Terrence Dicks asks to have his name taken off because what remains has nothing to do with his original proposal. But then, of course, Terrence Dicks really kind of embraces the changes that were made and becomes a big Brain of Morbius supporter and keeps revisiting the scenario in his books. In fact, insofar as the very last thing he ever wrote for the 2019 Target storybook takes place on Karn inside Salen's castle, featuring the Warlord, who happens to be played by the same actor who played Salen all those years later. So you can't get very far from the Brain of Morbius in terms of Terrence Dicks. And then in terms of that whole season 6B, these adventures that the Second Doctor and Jamie have after the War Games, Terrence, I think, wrote 3 novels in the 90s and 2000s set inside that season 6B. So Robert Holmes casually creates this continuity nightmare, and Terrence Dicks goes, I'm going to move in, and I'm going to tell many stories set within this continuity hole that can't possibly exist. So the two of them certainly had a very symbiotic relationship, would you say?
Oh, yes. And, partly because of their friendship, they both script edited each other at various points. It is odd that Terrence wrote a script that they wouldn't be able to film, given his experience on Doctor Who. Usually he's the guy, who can put something together like Horror of Fang Rock, which is 2 or 3 locations you can do in the studio, small number of actors, you can do it quickly, no fuss. So it's interesting that he wrote something that was, for what is actually quite an ambitious time for the program visually, that he did something that even they couldn't achieve then. But yeah, they're really interesting. They are 2 of the most influential classic writers that they're still referenced now, and I think there's a great they're obviously very fond of each other. I think very fond, and it's interesting. Some of Terrence's later books are certainly indulgent. I'm actually not a huge Series 6B fan. I think the ending of the War Games is so weird and unsettling that the idea that he goes spinning off into the darkness and then goes and has some more adventure. Troughton, sorry, I should clarify, goes spinning off into the darkness, screaming no, 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 and then goes and has some more adventures. Doesn't quite sit right with me, but whatever. that's a personal opinion.
To be fair to Terrence, which really should be the name of this podcast, come to think of it, to be fair to Terrence, he wrote both the War Games and all that spin-off material. Have you read the Target storybook?
For the War Games? You mean the recent storybook that came out? Sorry.
Yeah, it was one Target style adventure for each Doctor, and Terrence wrote the one for the Second Doctor. If you haven't read it yet, it's for Terrence Dicks, who's usually very reliable and comforting. It's a very disturbing story with some very sinister implications and a very downbeat ending. And it's, I don't want to say it's atypical for Terrence because he was so talented, but you wouldn't expect to have that reaction to a Terrence Dicks story, certainly written in 2019. So I would highly recommend you check that out. Even if you're not a big Season 6B person, this might be the story that sells you on it.
Oh, I definitely will, actually. It's been on my to buy list that for a while, but once I finish reading all these new adventures, I'll give it a go.
And just to bring into the conversation that we're recording, something that we talked about offline earlier, I think you were the one who asked, do we know if Terrence Dicks' original script for Brain of Morbius still exists?
Yeah, because I mean, I kind of presume they don't, because, and this is a joke, but I'm also genuine. Big Finish would have adapted them already if they existed. Like,
Yeah.
they've adapted like first drafts of Revenge of the Cybermen. So an unproduced Terrence script, which would be very different from the original, would be go to them. So I genuinely think they can't. I don't know. Maybe there's an outline still there. But we've got so many great people who have scoured the archives for these things that I feel like if there were complete scripts, we'd have seen them by now.
I know that Philip Hinchcliffe's biographer, and that's a book that's coming out soon, was at the Written Archives a couple of weeks ago. So maybe that individual, who's a friend of this podcast, will have seen them. Or if anyone out there knows, I would love to know what remains of Terrence's original proposal. I am positive that when the Season 13 Blu-rays come out, and may that be sooner rather than later, because I would love to revisit some of those stories in deluxe format with Behind the Sofas and the original scripts on BD-ROM. I would love to know what's out there, and I would love to know if there's any dialogue in there that survived into the Holmes version, because Dicks was a terrific scriptwriter. He had a lot more hits than misses in the Doctor Who world. Even if that script was unfilmable, I'm sure it would have been tremendously entertaining, and I would love to know what he made of that scenario, trying to do an inversion of Frankenstein. So maybe someone out there who knows can reach out and tell us what we missed when Terrence did the original version of Brain of Morbius. In terms of the novelization itself, I think you said this was the very first time you read it?
Yes, and it was fantastic, really good. I mean, it's the thing about Terrence, isn't it? Everyone says it, and it's almost a cliche now, but it's so true. Is that his prose is so effective? It is lean and it is effective, and not a word is wasted. And I think that's that's a real talent that's underappreciated, I think, among authors today. It actually always makes me think of, and I think maybe was an influence in him, like Raymond Chandler, who's, if you read his books at his prime, everything is used, every sentence, every word has a purpose, and I always get that a little bit reading Terrence as well. So no, it was a fantastic read.
It's funny that you mentioned Raymond Chandler, because Chandler was a huge influence on Terrence, especially if you read Blood Harvest, his 1994 NA. I guess you're not covering that one for the real McCoy, because that's not exactly a heavy hitter, not exactly a tentpole of the range.
No, but I have read it. I do remember it. So you're right. That kind of private eye fiction is definitely an influence on his work.
Most of the NA writers were all around the same age, born between the late 60s and the early 70s, and they all have the same pop culture references, which is why you have so many quotes to a particular era of British music and a particular era of British television and playwrights. Terrence would have been at least 30 years older than the oldest of that generation of UK fans who wrote the bulk of the New Adventures. Terrence is writing pop culture. It's his pop culture, which is 30 years earlier. So it helps to know Casablanca, which is quoted again inside Brain of Morbius rather wonderfully. And it helps to be familiar with Raymond Chandler and the things that Terrence loves. So Terrence is telling his kind of story in Blood Harvest. It's just 30 years further back in time than anybody else was writing. But I think Blood Harvest, which was derided and torched on Rec Arts when it came out, that is a book worth revisiting, I think, although obviously it's not the focus of this episode. But you make some really interesting points about Terrence, which I will echo later on in the program as I break down the book. You talk about him never wasting a word. What do you think of his scene setting, the way that he describes scenes, and the way that he describes characters, and the way that he describes, in particular, action sequences?
I mean, it's always interesting, isn't it, when you read an adaptation of something you know really well? Because I've seen Brain of Morbius a lot, particularly when I was a teenager. So you're always kind of picturing it a little bit the TV version in your head. But I think my favourite thing is the way is the layers that he adds. So the thing that really struck out to me, the first thing in the book is, and the first thing we see on the TV story as well, is this insect alien, which is a mutant costume from the mutants.
Right.
And you see Kondo slaughter it, and it's on the TV. It's what, 20 seconds at the most. It's quick. It's just
if that, right?
Yeah, it's quick. It's effective. It's setting an atmosphere. But here, Terrence gives him the insect a name. He gives him a culture. He gives him a purpose. He gets all these. He gets a whole life. And again, it's not too long, but it just adds. He didn't have to do that, but it just adds a bit more. Rather than just going, there was an alien and he got killed. It gives you a sense of a wider universe that I really like. And I think
rather wonderfully, I want to point out, he could have just said this is one of the creatures from the mutants, because he had commissioned the mutants, and the novelization came out literally the same year as the novelization of Morbius. But he goes back and creates a different backstory. It's not a mutant from that story. It's a completely different alien world. He creates this entire civilization and burns it off in 3 or 4 pages, which I wish I had that kind of imagination. I never let go of an idea, but he was able to do that because he's Terrence Dicks and I'm not.
And I think, in terms of action, in some ways, because the TV story has its moments of quite shocking violence. And I'm not one of these people. I never like to go, kids would have been upset by this or kids would have been upset by that, because to be honest, we all end up just creating these imaginary children in our heads or audience in our heads and goes, this is what they'd be like, or this isn't. And I don't think that works. But when Solon shoots Kondo in episode 3, it's quite a violent moment. You don't see, do you see blood? But you see the gun go off and you see the bullet hit him. Like, there's no doubt about that.
Right.
And in the book, it feels less shocking, maybe because it's not a visual representation, and Terrence just kind of is very. He doesn't over describe what's happened. It's very much, this has happened, this is it, and so it doesn't feel as shocking. And of course, then there's the cyanide at the end, which is a really interesting thing. Because I'm not one of these people who thinks, I don't think the Doctor is a pacifist, and I don't believe the idea that the Doctor doesn't kill. I don't think they should like to kill. I don't think it should be something they should seek to do. But they walk more in shades of grey sometimes because they have to. I just point people towards Capaldi's rather lovely moment of thin ice where he's talking to Bill about it, and I feel that sums it up for me personally. But Terrence really emphasises why the Doctor is having to use cyanide and how, because he mentions over and over again in the text in the book that isn't in the television version, about how Khan was this great civilization or this populated planet, and he constantly then describes it as it is now, which is as a ruin, as this kind of broken place. With only a scattered handful of people living on it compared to the millions that were, and this is all because of Morbius. And he really emphasises the threat of Morbius, so that when the Doctor does what he does, it's at least there's a reason for it. There's a reason for it in the TV movie as well. But Terrence was really like, there's a reason that this man who does not like violence is doing this.
Yeah, I want to explore that for a moment, because Robert Holmes did tend to recycle himself, and I don't say that in a negative way at all, because he wrote for Doctor Who over a long period of years.
Yeah.
So it's inevitable that he's going to come back to the same ideas and pet preferences over and over. But there are moments in Brain of Morbius that strongly suggest later stories. The idea of there being only a minuscule bit of the miracle cure that can only go to one character, and someone has to die in order to save somebody else. That happens to Marin at the end, and we'll see that revisited in a much more powerful way in Caves of Androzani. The death by cyanide, as some people pronounce it, people who like to say it correctly, The death by cyanide is also seen in Two Doctors rather infamously. But if you had to compare those two moments, in Morbius, the Doctor tries to give Solon the benefit of the doubt. Solon brings him in as an ally to recover the deranged Morbius beast early in Part 4. And the Doctor will work with him the same way that the Doctor worked with Scorby, another psychopath, later in Season 13 in The Wonderful Seeds of Doom. And he rather naively expects that Solon is going to follow his orders and dismantle the creature. And the Doctor leaves Solon alone and goes back down to the crypt in order to revive Sarah Jane, who'd been knocked unconscious in the previous episode. And while that happens, Solon sneaks downstairs, locks him in, and goes back upstairs to revive rather than dismantle Morbius. Only then does the Doctor resort to cyanide as a way of stopping Solon and the creature, and Sarah Jane is his willing accomplice, finding the prussic acid and helping him. And I think you mentioned this offline. There's a little bit of a plot hole in why that cyanide doesn't drift back and kill the Doctor and Sarah too. But Terrence goes in and fills in that plot hole.
Yes, he talks about the strong upward draft and make it clear that they've both got things over their mouths. And obviously he watched that and went, "Why aren't they dead?" So he went to fill that back in. But I mean, the Two Doctors is such an interesting comparison to this because what the Doctor does to Shockeye is, because he clamps it over his mouth in that, it's a lot more violent. His use of it is, it's a lot more personal in some ways, and whether this is at least somewhat more detached, I guess. And I guess we probably let it slide more in Morbius because honestly, it's obviously people's opinions always differ, but it's generally a better story. And I think it's funny, we'll always let things slide if the story's good. It's amazing what you'll let slide for characters, where if the story's bad or maybe not as satisfying, you'll pick out those things more. So I think that does play to Morbius's favor, and it's less personal way of doing it than it is in the Two Doctors as well, so maybe it feels a bit less shocking.
I think Morbius, and again, we're talking about murder by cyanide. I think to the extent that a murder is ever justified, I think Brain of Morbius works to make it justified within the text. The Doctor gives Solon a chance. Yeah. Solon betrays him. The Doctor is locked in a castle, which is a former hydrogen reactor, so the Doctor just happens to know the layout. That's his only way of stopping it, and it doesn't work. I mean, it kills Solon, but we learned that Morbius has the lungs of a Beerstrop and is able to filter the cyanide out, so it doesn't work. Whereas in the Two Doctors, the Doctor never works with Shockeye, never gives him the benefit of the doubt, never gives him a second chance. If you do this, we'll be fine. And like you say, rather than doing it remotely, he clamps it over the fellow's mouth, and it works this time, whereas it doesn't fully work in Brain of Morbius. So this may be tortured logic, but I think it is better done in Morbius than it is in Two Doctors, which I think is a little more disturbing and cynical. But maybe I'm just reaching at straws and trying to give him a pass. But I think Brain of Morbius does work better in that regard.
Yeah, no, I'd agree 100%.
And I want to talk about the offspring of Brain of Morbius. There's the obvious one and there's the non-obvious one. So let's talk about the non-obvious one first. You have two alien creatures who don't appear in Brain of Morbius, but Holmes tosses them off as apocryphal continuity references, which was Robert Holmes' stock in trade almost. You have Marin talking about the silent gas dirigibles of the Hutai, which in the novelization is rechristened as Mutai. And then you have Morbius talking about the lungs of a Beerstrop. You have two different 1990s Virgin Publishing Doctor Who texts that revisit each of those alien creatures. Isn't that pretty incredible?
I never underestimate Doctor Who writers in the 90s attempts to find obscure continuity references they can stuff in. I mean, Hutai, the use of them in Love War is particularly funny when essentially they're just another fart joke from Robert Holmes, a writer who puts in a surprising number of them into his work.
Power of Kroll was that's all Power of Kroll is, yes.
We'd say now about Power of Kroll that he was trolling. We'd say that now, but Yeah.
The Power of Troll. That's another Philip Madoc story, by the way. But I think you had Shannon, who's been on this program. You had her as your guest voice for Love and War on the Real McCoy. So
Yes.
that's another episode that I highly recommend. I think I liked the book a little more than you guys did, but I do recommend that episode.
Yeah, I mean, I do like I like the book. Eric's a little less keen on it, but it was certainly it's enjoyable. It's a good read, and it's certainly yeah, I would recommend it.
And Andy Lane, not in the NAs directly, but in the Decalogues, which was the NA adjacent volume of multi-doctor short stories. Andy Lane tells a short story involving a Birastrop invading Earth during the 1970s, in between Doctor Who and the Silurians and the Ambassadors of Death, which serves as a bridge between those two classic Pertwee stories, and gives him a chance to pull a Paul Cornell and say, "You're not the only one who can bring back these apocryphal creatures referenced once in the Brain of Morbius and then never mentioned again, but now they're the permanent part of Doctor Who lore." So those are the non-obvious. Let's talk about the elephant in the room. When you watched The Timeless Children and you saw that, you suddenly realized that the entire 3-year story arc Chibnall Master Plan is based around 45 seconds of Brain of Morbius. What was your reaction? I wonder if it was quite as visceral as mine.
I think it was like a lot of the Chibnall era. I think my reaction was, "Oh, that's a choice." To be honest, I just, like I said earlier, I think Robert Holmes would find it hilarious, but I'm not against the idea. I just haven't been sold on it, if that makes sense. Like, if you're going to do it, fine, do it, but you have to sell the idea, and I don't think the idea has been sold. So I thought it was odd. I thought it was a really odd choice, to be honest, and I still do.
Nobody loves the classic series more than me. My favorite new series Doctor out of the 5 principal ones has been Peter Capaldi, because he so richly brings in. He's wearing John Pertwee's costume. He deliberately structures his hairstyle across all 3 of his seasons to match John Pertwee's bouffant, to use a Terrence Dicks word. And he literally mimics Tom Baker directly in several of his first season stories. Like, you cannot watch Kill the Moon or Mummies on the Orient Express without thinking, they are deliberately doing Hinchcliffe. And Hinchcliffe works just as well in 2014 as he did in the mid-1970s. So as much as I prefer the classic series to the new, and as much as I am a classic series guy, I think it's a bad idea to build your 2022 master plan universe around 45 seconds from Brain of Morbius. I think somebody should have stood athwart Chibnall shouting, "Stop," to quote William F. Buckley, because I just don't think that's a good idea. I mean, most of your audience now was born well after Brain of Morbius was aired and novelized. There are some great corners to the Doctor Who universe. Doctor Who contradicts the Morbius faces a year later in Deadly Assassin when they go back and they say that Time Lords only have 13 lives. Spending 3 years of Jodie Whittaker's poor, underutilized Doctor just to explain the discrepancy between Morbius and Deadly Assassin, which, by the way, were written by the same guy. I think there's better things to do with your time to impress a 22 audience. I really, really do. And I'm starting to rant and soapbox. I am a huge defender of Jodie Whittaker. I think she has not gotten her dues as a good Doctor, giving a great performance. I think there's some wonderful stories in her era, especially the revival of the celebrity historical. I don't think Timeless Children works, and not because I'm annoyed that there are Doctors before Hartnell. I just think you shouldn't do that with your series 45 years later. You should not be building it around a 45-second out-of-context clip. That's only my opinion. I could be wrong. I will cede the floor back to you, my friend.
Yeah, I mean, I think my thing was, I don't mind the idea there are other incarnations of the Doctor before Hartnell. That's fine. I don't necessarily think they should be the Doctor, but, having said that, one of my absolute highlights of the Jodie Whittaker era has been Joe Martin. So I'm like, but, we get Joe Martin, so Which is odd when somebody pointed out her amount of on-screen time during that era is actually not even 20 minutes as the Doctor. But she, I do think she's fantastic. I just, like I said, Doctor Who's full of like moments where it's like, oh, we've changed everything or we've ignored everything. A lot of them by Robert Holmes. So I'm always up for, if I felt the story had a push or a meaning or something behind it, I would probably be more on board. But I'm just a bit like, okay, this will be it. I don't think Russell's going to mention this at all when he comes back. I think it's going to be, not. I don't think Russell by any means is going to do a hard reboot. I think it's going to be, one of those soft reboots that Doctor Who goes through, where it goes, right, new audience, new Doctor. Let's concentrate on the future. Yeah. I mean, he tried to do something big, and I respect that. I just feel it. I don't know why he did it. At the end of the day, I think that's it. I couldn't tell you why. I couldn't tell the story reason, the story purpose, and I think it's a shame. I think it's a shame, but it works for some. Works for some people.
It does, and Russell loves his continuity too. Lest we forget, Russell is the guy who turned Gridlock into a backdoor sequel to the Macro Terror. When Russell said Neil Patrick Harris is going to be in the Doctor Who universe, we are led to believe, cast Neil Patrick Harris as a villain from 1966. And what is Russell doing right now? He's filming an episode with a past Doctor and a past companion, the 10th Doctor, one of the two 10th Doctors, and Donna. So it isn't that Dave is going to give us a hard reboot that has no continuity at all. No, certainly he's doing a sequel now to a story that is older than the two of us and is almost as old as Russell himself. But there's a way to do it well, and there's a way to not do it well. And I think that Chibnall probably should have had somebody next to him saying, bruh, no, try again.
I mean, I think ultimately, if I'm being really basic, my main thought at the end of a Doctor Who story was I bored? Not is it good, is it bad, but was I bored? And if I'm being honest, The Timeless Children, I was a bit bored at the end of it. The thing I really liked was the incredibly camp Cyber Lords, because they were so camp with those that I thought that's an amazing bit of design. But then they all got blown up, so there we go.
Well, we know from the trailer to the Centenary special that one character from Timeless Children is being brought back. Whether as an active character or a flashback, we don't know. But we'll get to revisit, pardon me, some of that again. But the big revelation about the Timeless Children was not found out in the action. It was delivered by a 20-minute speech that somebody told the Doctor as she was standing against a green screen. The classic series, as poorly aged as the effects are, it knew how to tell a story economically because it's telling a story 25 minutes. So the exposition in Deadly Assassin is active exposition. The Doctor walks around the Matrix. He's the one who's delivering the revelations. Wherein both Timeless Children and in Survivors of the Flux, which brings back Tecteun, the 13th Doctor is through no fault of Jodie Whittaker's own, because she doesn't write and she doesn't produce her own scripts. She's merely delivering them. Makes her a very passive character to whom things happen, whereas she ought to be the plot engine, so to speak. But again, we're not here to destroy Chris Chibnall. We're here to talk about how much we love Brain of Morbius. So before we wrap up, let me give you the last word on Brain of Morbius. Do you think Robert Holmes would love the idea that his story is still, over and over again, being brought back to bring in new corners to the universe, whether it's Love and War, or the Andy Lane short story, or the Timeless Children, or Terrence Dix's 2019 short story set in Solon's Castle? Do you think he would appreciate that this replacement script has had such long legs?
I think it's difficult to know what he'd think. I think I imagine, like any writer, he'd be happy that people stood appreciating his work. I think he'd be bemused at the fact that people weren't just ignoring things he'd done and creating their own continuity instead. So I think he'd be happy but bemused, I suspect.
That's a very good point. So let's then play a game. So we're going to play a game today of 20 questions. I have selected one Doctor Who story at random from 1963 to the present off of the randomizer.net. I know what story it is. You do not. And using 20 yes or no questions, I want you to guess the story. Nobody has failed the game yet on Doctor Who literature. Simon Hart was able to guess it in 7. Some people have taken a little bit longer than that, but nobody has failed, so I don't think you're going to be the first one to not succeed, but are you ready to go?
I'm ready.
Question number 1, please.
Was it made in the 21st century?
Yes, it was made in the 21st century. See, you're off to a flying start. Question 2.
Was the showrunner Stephen Moffat?
No, the showrunner was not Stephen Moffat. That narrows it down. Question 3.
Was the showrunner RTD?
Yes, the showrunner was RTD. Question 4.
Is Rose in it?
Yes, Rose is in the story in question. Question 5.
Is it an Eccleston story?
Yes, it is an Eccleston story. Question 6. And I want to point out that you are on the precipice of history now. If you get it in one of the next 2 questions, you can either set or tie the all-time Doctor Who literature record for fastest time answering 20 questions. So let's see if you can carry it across the finish line. Question 6.
No pressure. Are the Daleks in it?
No, the Daleks are not in it. Question 7 for the tie.
Is it Rose?
It is not Rose. So you don't quite break Simon's record, but you are still well in line to finish. I think there are fewer stories left than questions you have remaining, so you are guaranteed to get it. Question 8.
Was it written by RTD?
Yes. No, it was not. It was not written by RTD. It was not an RTD script. Question 9.
Is it The Unquiet Dead?
Yes, it is. Ding, ding, ding. Got it in 9. One of our best showings ever.
Hey, best thing I've done all week. There we go.
You were not messing around, for sure. So, Adam, where else can we find you on the internet?
Well, you can find me on Twitter at Adam J. Clegg. It's a basic mix of talking about Doctor Who and despairing at politics, like a lot of Twitter these days. Equally, you can follow the Real McCoy podcast at real_pod, and you can find us on iTunes and most other podcasting platforms.
And leave us with a recommendation. What is something else you're enjoying right now, whether it's Doctor Who related or not?
It's not Doctor Who related, but I recently finished watching the 3rd season of The Umbrella Academy, which is on Netflix. It's a very good example of a particular favourite subgenre of mine, which is absolute losers with superpowers.
I have not seen that yet, but you are not the first time that I've heard that recommendation, so I will definitely go on ahead and check that out.
It's great. I definitely start from the first episode though. Don't start on series 3. It will make no sense.
Yeah, I've heard that series 3 is based on some of the furore. I've heard that there are some definite changes, but I haven't seen seasons 1 and 2 yet, so I'm in no position to judge. Adam, thanks so much for joining me on Doctor Who Literature. We're going to have you back on real soon now.
Thank you so much for having me on. It's been a real pleasure.
Doctor Who and the Brain of Morbius, written by Terrance Dicks, televised as The Brain of Morbius, teleplay by Robert Holmes, from a story by Terrance Dicks, screen credit to Robin Bland, televised in January 1976, published June 1977. Why do so many spaceships crash land on Karn, a bleak, lonely, and seemingly deserted planet? Are they doomed by the mysterious powers of the strange black-robed sisterhood, jealously guarding their secret of eternal life? Or does the mad Dr. Solon, for some evil purpose of his own, need the bodies of the victims, and more especially, the body of Doctor Who? At the Gallifrey 1 convention in Los Angeles in February 2020, the last major U.S. con before the COVID pandemic shut everything down for the better part of 2 years, there was a panel devoted to the memory of Terrance Dicks, who just died 5 months earlier. I was not on the panel, though I was on a couple or 3 others that same weekend. You gotta bring heavy hitters on stage for a panel like Terrence Dicks's Memory, and as far as the heavy hitters of Doctor Who cognoscenti go, I am more of a light-hitting utility infielder. But I was definitely in the audience, absorbing the stories and mentally taking notes. The lasting memory I have from that panel is that Terrence's email address incorporated the name Robin Bland. Now, that's an incredible bit of trivia. Robin Bland, as even light-hitting utility infielders know, from Mario Mendoza right on down to Spike Owen, apologies to non-baseball fans, didn't really exist, except as far as the Brain of Morbius went. So you know the basics. Terrence submitted a story that was an inversion on Frankenstein. Robert Holmes, for budget reasons, flipped it right back round. Terrence realized that not a word of his original story survived into Holmes's own, asked for his name to be taken off the story in favor of, quote, some bland pseudonym, and Robert Holmes, as the legend and the DVD text commentary goes, and Holmes was nothing if not wickedly funny, obliged with the request. Now, Terrence could have gotten very annoyed about this, but instead, it seems that he came to embrace the Brain of Morbius over the years. The Robert Holmes version of the story aired under some bland pseudonym, and wonderfully, not even the best Robert Holmes story from season 13 to go out under a pseudonym. So check out episode 27 of our back catalog. In later years, Terrence in his original novels, starting with 1991's Time Worm Exodus, The Second New Adventure, and also check out my NA's documentary on Trap 1 released in July 2021, made frequent reference back to the events of Morbius, and wound up even writing a combined prequel/sequel, The Past Doctor Adventure Warmonger. The very last bit of fiction that Terrence ever wrote for Doctor Who, for 2019's The Target Storybook, and Mark and I recorded a Trap 1 on that as well, so please forgive all of this relentless self-promotion, took place in part on Karn, inside Morbius's, and later, Professor Solon's castle. And think about that for a moment, because it was another Terrence co-creation, the Warlord, who featured in that short story, which is the best kind of continuity reference there is, because the Warlord and Professor Solon were both played on TV by the same actor. At any rate, one could have forgiven Terrence for not wanting anything to do with Brain of Morbius, the story that supplanted and replaced his own idea. But no, come to find out, he embraced it. He made it his own. And he even wrote the novelization, which came out 18 months or so after the TV episode, with Robin Bland getting original script copyright on the book's copyright page and on the second title page, based on the BBC television serial by Robin Bland, it says, right there on page 3. It's still mid-1977, and Terrence hasn't quite resorted to writing 100-page books yet. He's still hovering around the 135-page mark, which is long for a novelization. Morbius starts on page 7 and ends on page 140, ends up being about 136 pages. It is in fact Terrence's fourth book of 1977 in just 6 months, and he still hasn't shortened up. This year must have taken a lot out of him, but he sure left it all on the page. I could devote a full hour just to the 3-page prologue featuring Kriz, a mute role on TV that was over in seconds. Kriz was played by an actor in costume left over from the Jon Pertwee serial The Mutants, which we'll be talking about here in 2 weeks or so, planned for episode 35. But Terrence takes the time to invent a completely different backstory for Kriz, not related to the mutants, with poetic dialogue and the wonderful sentence of death, "The blade flashed down, and his pain was over." What I'm more interested in talking about this week is how Terrence, who wrote terrifically detailed and violent books aimed at kids, handled the Robert Holmes script, which was typically full of clever insults and suggestive, and at times borderline offensive language, as we'll be talking about when we come to the Talons of Wang Chiang book in episode 37 in another month or so. Holmes' dialogue for Brain of Morbius features literally hundreds of nasty and memorably funny insults. It had been years before this week since I reread the Morbius novelization, and I wanted to know, how did Terrence adapt all that to the page? Now, of course, I do want to mention things that were changed from TV or other of Terrence's common literary devices. On page 10, for example, we learn that the Sisterhood of Karn wears black robes, although it was read on TV in 1976, and would still be read on the internet for 2013's webisode Night of the Doctor, which features yet another spaceship crashing onto Karn, this time taking the Eighth Doctor along with it. On page 11, Terence foreshadows Morbius by describing Solon working on a sculpture of, quote, a face for a king and emperor. On page 15, Terence describes the TARDIS as, quote, chameleon mechanism, long before I think the term chameleon circuit was ever mentioned on TV. Page 17 features the word capacious again, and page 18 features Terence apologizing for the Fourth Doctor's at times angry TV persona. Quote, he was already beginning to feel rather ashamed of his childish behavior, and even the achievement of a particularly fine backward double loop didn't make him feel any better. Chapter 1 also preserves the first two Holmes insults, half-witted cannibal, Solon describing Kondo, and meddlesome interfering idiots, the Doctor describing the Time Lords. Terence throws a lot of exposition at the reader, in sometimes a less than literary way. He tells us about the Sisterhood's immortality and the elixir of life on page 23, even before the only two proper Sisterhood characters, Marin and Ohika, are properly introduced. That wasn't strictly necessary, but the description of Marin on page 24 makes up for it. Quote, perhaps because of her great age, Marin was always reluctant to accept anything new. The Hootai on TV, made famous in the later New Adventure Love and War, are renamed the Mootai for the book, Moothi, also on page 24. In terms of TV insults, Chapter 2 preserves both from the corresponding TV material. Stupid ox, Solon describing Kondo, surly host, Solon describing himself. What impresses me here is that Terence is not rearranging or consolidating scenes, as he did with his two previous novelizations, Dalek Invasion of Earth, episode 30, and The Claws of Axos, episode 31. Rather, this is nearly a 100% faithful scene-for-scene, word-for-word adaptation. Chapter 2, in fact, adds words that weren't heard on TV. Mahendri Solon is introduced as a doctor, blue lobster is served for dinner in the castle, and Solon bullies Kondo into decanting the wine, using the word decanting, not just opening, as on TV. Terence must have right away recognized how wonderful the script was, if he wasn't going to tinker with it at all. Or perhaps he was working from the transmission scripts, rather than the rehearsal script this time, as the book retains Tom Baker's ad-lib about a glass of water. Chapter 3 preserves a long run of TV insults. Despicable, criminally minded wretches, the Doctor, describing Morbius. Third-rate hack, Solon, describing other, less talented surgeons. Spineless parasites and pacifist degenerates, Solon, describing the Time Lords. However, it does not transcribe the sisters chanting, so wonderfully over the top, on TV.
Form a circle, sisters.
One never really overcomes the nostalgia for one's planet of origin. Sometimes at night I look up to the sky and I think, will I ever see Earth again?
I know the feeling.
What made you settle on Khan?
Well, nobody lives here, nobody bothers me, I can get on with my work.
Oh, what kind of work is that?
Microsurgical Techniques into Tissue Transplant. Was the title of the book you published?
You know something of my history, Doctor.
One of the foremost neurosurgeons of your time. Considerably after your time, sir. Yes. Your disappearance caused quite a stir. It was said by some you'd joined the followers of the cult of Morbius.
Malice, academic jealousy. I just had to get away.
So, our enemy thinks himself safe in Solon's castle.
By page 46 or 47, I'd abandoned my speculation that Terence would tone down the dialogue to spare the children. Solon here, This material is the first few minutes of Part 2 on television, but was supposed to have been the original Part 1 cliffhanger, rattles off some of the finest insults ever written. Chicken-brained biological disaster, accursed hag, squalid brood of harpies, palsied harridan. These insults, while nasty, are so poetic and use the language so well that I always smile to realize that they exist. B, I'm quite aware that you can never, ever, ever use any of these in real life, but Dick transcribes them all faithfully. I'm assuming which led in the autumn of 1977 to a spate of British schoolchildren trying out these insults on their teachers, and promptly getting the strictest forms of punishment then still available to recalcitrant youth. Terence does give Kondo the last word, at least in this part of the book. Quote, Kondo listened unimpressed to this flood of threats. He was a practical man in his simple way, and clearly shouting wouldn't help them. Terence on page 49 also dips inside the Fourth Doctor's head to put the Doctor's verbal clowning in context. Quote, as usual, in a tricky situation, the Doctor was talking nonsense to give himself time to think. This is otherwise, like I said, a remarkably faithful novelization, considering that Terence could be forgiven for having an animus towards the story. There are very slight variances between TV dialogue and book dialogue, but the main thrust of the words are the same, and the scenes mostly occur in TV order without any rearrangement, apart from one notable exception that we'll talk about in a few minutes. On page 61, Terence adds the explanation that rhineweed is a highly flammable oil, used not only by Marin to stimulate the dying sacred flame, but also to hasten the Doctor's being burned at the stake. And page 65 features a wonderful description of Michael Spice's Morbius voice. Quote, it was a terrifying voice, thick with pain and hate. Terence builds up Kondo's little crush on Sarah. In Chapter 6, the end of the Part 2 material, he has Kondo feed Sarah, who's temporarily blinded, and left in Solon's care, for want of a better word, and we see Kondo's features soften as he looks after our helpless companion. This material is not on TV, though Kondo's crush on Sarah will emerge later. Terence just does a more thorough job of working it into the narrative earlier. The Part 2 cliffhanger, occurring in the book on page 77, at the end of Chapter 6, is an interesting narrative cheat. On TV, we have the camera, and we can see what Sarah doesn't, that she's talking to the Brain of Morbius. In a jar! In the book, though, the POV is Sarah's, and Terence has to pull back and explain to us exactly what the camera showed the audience, but what Sarah couldn't see through her own temporarily blinded eyes. Quote, Sarah peered blindly towards the voice, wondering if she was trapped with a madman, and so indeed she was in a way, though with one that had, for the moment, no power to harm her. Sarah wished desperately that she could see, but perhaps at this moment her blindness was something of a blessing. The anguished, threatening voice that so terrified her came from a greenly glowing tank in the center of the room. The tank was filled with nutrient fluids. In its center floated a spongy gray and purple mass, the still-living brain of Morbius. Terence, on page 78, likens Morbius's life in the brain tank to sensory deprivation, and it's amazing to think this paragraph was written 4 years before the movie Altered States. Here's a listen. On the Earth in Sarah's time, scientists had conducted experiments into something called sensory deprivation. Subjects had floated in a tank of warm fluid, wearing suits and helmets that cut off all sensation. They could see nothing, hear nothing, feel nothing. Deprived of input of all the millions of signals we constantly receive from the world about us, the subjects had begun to have hallucinations, to lose all sense of time and place, and eventually to go mad. Something like this was happening to Morbius. Thanks to Solon's electronic devices, he was able to hear and speak, but the loss of all other sensory functions, of all his physical being, was beginning to upset the balance of his mind. The waiting time, in this limbo of non-existence, had gone on too long, and Morbius was now perilously close to madness. Terence also goes a step further, and imagines what happens to members of the Sisterhood who are deprived of the benefits of the elixir of life. On page 83, describing the grisly fate of a sister who once betrayed her order to Morbius and died horribly in front of Marin and the others. That is not suggested on TV, and one imagines Terence's creativity was fired up while writing the book, such as to invent that kind of detail. And while we've debated on this podcast whether or not the genius of Tom Baker's acting, genius is perhaps too mild a word, I think Terence's choice of simile suits the performance perfectly. On page 87, after being trapped in the sister's literal net, the doctor, quote, made no attempt to resist, watching these warlike proceedings with an air of quiet amusement, like a kindly uncle at a children's party, end quote. Getting back to world building, Terence also provides his usual meaty one-paragraph backstory of Morbius's reign of terror before having been ostensibly executed on Karn. Morbius, greatest of the High Council of the Time Lords, had sought to lead his people into paths of domination and conquest. Rejected by his people, he had fled from them in rage and anger. He had gone from planet to planet, preaching his gospel of conquest and destruction, raising an army of followers, leaving chaos and destruction behind him. Finally, the Time Lords had rallied. They too had raised an army, an alliance of all the civilized life forms menaced by Morbius and his hordes. They had hunted him through the galaxy, cornered him here on Karn, defeated him in one last terrible battle that had left the planet in ruins. Shaken out of their usual complacency by the revolt, the Time Lords had acted swiftly for once. Morbius had been tried and executed immediately on the planet that was the scene of his final defeat. That basically is the plot of Warmonger, by the way, in which Terence decides that a future Doctor, let's say, the fifth, wound up at the head of the Time Lord army fighting Morbius. Round about Chapter 8, Terence finally reorders scenes, something he had done liberally in his two previous books before this one, but this time it's done to great effect. On TV, the Doctor has two big scenes with Marin in Part 3, and that's interrupted by the business with Kondo recapturing Sarah on the stony plains of Karn. The capture-escape capture loops that were the lifeblood of the classic series' long-form storytelling, something the new series has the budget and modern TV format to avoid doing. In the book, Terence wisely realizes that this Dr. Marin material is terrific and need not be interrupted, so he consolidates it into one scene, taking up the bulk of Chapter 8, and moves the Kondo-Sarah business into a much longer consolidated scene that takes up most of Chapter 9.
Send the guards to the outer chamber. No eyes outside the sisterhood have ever looked upon the flame of life.
It is even lower.
Is it always this color?
Always.
Fascinating. And the heat from the flames causes oxidation of the chemicals in the rocks. And then, no doubt, a chemical reaction with rising superheated gases, and you have your elixir. The impossible dream of 1,000 alchemists dripping like tea from an urn.
Do not try to understand mysteries beyond the reach of the mind.
Oh, I wouldn't think they're beyond a decent spectrograph, Marin. One could probably synthesize that stuff by the gallon. The consequences would be appalling.
What do you mean?
What? Everyone trying to live forever, no. Death is the price we pay for progress, you know.
You speak in riddles, Doctor. The Time Lords were glad enough of the elixir.
Only in rare cases. When, for instance, there's some difficulty in regenerating a body, we don't take it regularly like you. Otherwise, we'd fall into the same trap.
And what trap are we in?
Immortality. You must have been old when the elixir was discovered. How many centuries have passed while you have remained unchanged? How long since anything here changed?
Nothing here ever changes.
Exactly my point. No progress. Please, stand back.
Reading so many Terence books in rapid succession, remember I'm covering a book a week for this show, I do tend to notice a lot of the magician's tricks. The phrase screamed in rage and pain pops up at least 3 times. You can also see Terence unconsciously slipping back into John Pertwee mode when writing the Fourth Doctor's dialogue. There are several more "my dear Sarahs" in the book, as opposed to the, 0 that we got on TV. Terence does give an explanation in the book for why the sisters deliver the seemingly dead body of the Doctor to Solon's castle in the first place at the end of Part 3. The inventive explanations covering seeming plot holes are more than worth the occasional bit of overused phrases. Oh, and hello! Here's Terence quoting Casablanca again, on page 119, as Sarah eulogizes the now-dead Kondo, prefacing with, "It hadn't exactly been a beautiful friendship." And skip on ahead 2 decades to Terence's past Doctor adventure Catastrophia for a much more obvious Casablanca homage. If you compare the scenes of the Doctor and Sarah in Solon Cellar, try saying that 5 times fast, as written versus TV, you'll prefer the TV version, where Sarah Jane has much more agency, finishing the Doctor's sentences, improving on his ideas, finding the prussic acid without being asked. None of that comes across in the book. As much as I'm jazzed by reading Terence, I gotta say, nothing beats Liz Sladen on TV. Nothing. Now, at the bottom of page 132 is what I initially thought was a typo, but is not, where Morbius says his followers will rise up in their milliards. That's an archaic word for a billion, evidently. Part 4 of the Brain of Morbius is now remembered, unfortunately, for all the wrong reasons. For those 45 seconds of the mind wrestling contest, endlessly dissected on Reckard's Doctor Who in the 1990s, and now serving as the centerpiece for Chris Chibnall's master plan, such as it is, as well as the inspiration for not 1, but now 2 separate volumes of Oberst Books' Forgotten Lives series, detailing the past adventures of the so-called Morbius Doctors. And those Oberst books are highly recommended, by the way. Volume 1, terrific. Volume 2 will soon be out. Terence in the novelization sort of hand-waves around the problem. His novelization of The Deadly Assassin is coming out a few months after this one, and will establish that a Time Lord only has 13 lives. Here, Terence condenses the 8 so-called timeless child faces down to a single sentence. Quote, "Sarah had a confused impression of even more faces on the screen." Hardly a sentence worth launching 46 years worth of fan fiction, and a whole era-long TV story arc. The novelization of The Brain of Morbius, I will say, is a book that I bought, as I mentioned last week, because I didn't understand what the word labolatry was, and that's what I thought Philip Madoc was saying to Kondo at the end of part 1. Bring him to the labolatry. Turns out that's just laboratory, as we say here in the States. That's the reason why I bought the book, to find out what that word was. It is, of course, not the reason why I keep reading the book over and over again. Terence takes a story that is not his own, but he makes it his own, and he comes back and revisits the scenario over and over again over the next 42 years worth of writing that he would do. He preserves the essential wit of the Robert Holmes scripts. He explains a few things that don't make quite so much sense, and his wordplay, even if he does tend to rely on the same phrases over and over again, is pretty hard to beat. Terence does technically flawless prose, which has been one of the main theses of this podcast, and we'll have a chance to explore that thesis further in the years to come, in both Terence books and, of course, in books by other authors to come in the 1980s who were perhaps not quite so technically adept. In short, Brain of Morbius is longer for a Terence book, but the pages fly by, the wordplay is terrific, there's really not a wasted word on the page.
Nectar? Stewed apricots? No custard?
Myron! She has sacrificed herself.
Was that the last?
Without it, he would have died.
It was ordained.
And Morbius?
He is destroyed. We owe you thanks, Doctor,
Oh,
but for your
please,
help...
Ohika, please. No speeches of gratitude. Sarah and I have an engagement.
We have?
Come along.
Thank you, Ahika.
Goodbye, sisters. Oh, in case you have trouble with the chimney.
What are they?
A mighty atom and a thunder flash.
There is some Ancient writing here, Doctor. Is it a Time Lord spell? What does it say?
Write the blue touch paper and stand clear.
Next time on Doctor Who Literature, shockingly, the Target books are going to take a month off, and the next paperback novelization will skip July to come out in August 1977. We're still at the high point of the Philip Hinchcliffe era, which ended on TV a few months earlier, in the book line, with the Graham Williams era having not quite started on television just yet. There were 5 stories shot during the season 13 production block, but 6 stories aired, with the Terror of the Zygons, novelized as Doctor Who and the Loch Ness Monster, having been made earlier, but held back to serve as the Series 13 premiere. Of those 6 stories, 4 of them were among the first 33 Target books to come out. And next week, we'll discuss the penultimate novelization of a season 13 story. Scientists may buy their privilege to experiment at the cost of total responsibility, but for us readers, it's a privilege to buy Terrence Dix's ongoing prose experiments at the cost of total enjoyment. Join me and a longtime friend of the program as we discuss Doctor Who and the planet of evil. Thank you for joining me on another episode of the Doctor Who Literature Podcast. I'm Jason, your host and editor and producer. Special thanks to my special guest, Adam Clegg. This podcast can be found on iTunes, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and most of your podcast apps of choice. You can find all past episodes at anchor.fm/DoctorWhoLit. It really helps if you rate 5 stars and subscribe. You can find me on Twitter at Doctor Who Novels, that's Dr. Who Novels, and you can also find me on Trap1. I write about Doctor Who on Twitter using the hashtag Doctor Who Pilgrimage, that's Dr. Who Pilgrimage. Please drop me a line with your comments, questions, and suggestions. Next time we'll be discussing another novelization, and we'll again be joined by a very special guest. Thank you for listening, and whatever you do, keep turning the pages.